There's a particular kind of silence that follows betrayal, not the silence of absence, the silence of presence without connection, the silence of people in the same room who can no longer look at each other. The Lucas family learned that silence in 1975 and never fully escaped it. To understand what Frank Lucas destroyed the day he named his brothers to the FBI, you need to understand what he built with them first, because the empire wasn't just Frank's. It was a family enterprise, built on blood and trust and the particular loyalty that comes from growing up in the same two-room shack, sharing the same hunger, making the same promises to each other in the dark. The Lucas brothers came from La Grange, North Carolina. Frank was oldest, then Hubert, then Larry, then Terrence, and the others after them. 6 children in poverty so deep. Felt inherited, Mahaley cleaning houses, their father in the fields, never enough of anything, never room to breathe. Frank left first at 15 with $40 and a promise, but the promise wasn't just for himself, it was implicitly for all of them. If Frank made it, they all made it. That's how it worked in families like theirs. You pulled each other up or you stayed down together. Frank made it, and when he did, he kept the promise. 1965. Frank had been in Harlem for almost 20 years, had learned at Bumpy Johnson's side, had built a small but solid operation, had money, had respect, had the beginnings of what would become blue magic. He called his brothers. One by one, come to New York. I have something for you. There's a place for you here. Hubert came first, 31 years old, had been working tobacco fields since he was old enough to follow their father, hands already worn at 31. Frank looked at his brother's hands and felt something fierce and protective. You'll never work fields again, Frank told him. I promise you that. Hubert looked around Frank's apartment. The furniture, the clothes, the neighborhood. What do I do? I'll show you. Then Larry came, then Terrence. One by one, Frank pulled his brothers out of North Carolina and brought them into the operation. Gave them roles, responsibilities, money they'd never seen in La Grange, cars, apartments, lives that felt after the nothing of rural poverty like freedom. Frank was careful about how he used them, didn't put them on the front lines, didn't expose them to unnecessary risk, kept them in roles where they were useful. But protected because these were his brothers, his blood, his responsibility. Hubert ran distribution logistics for the Bronx operation, knew the routes, knew the timing, knew how to move product without patterns that law enforcement could track. He was good at it, methodical, quiet, reliable. Larry worked the financial side, not the glamorous part, the invisible part, moving money through businesses that made it look clean, tracking what came in and what went out. Making sure the operation's finances were as invisible as its supply chain. Terrence handled communications, the connective tissue between different parts of the operation, making sure Frank's instructions got to the right people at the right time without creating paper trails or digital records. They built the empire together, not equally. Frank was always the architect, the strategist, the public face, but together, as a family. Sunday dinners at Mahaley's house when she visited. Brothers catching up, talking about the old days in La Grange, laughing about how far they'd come from the tobacco fields and the two-room shack. They never talked explicitly about what they were doing, had an unspoken agreement not to name it directly in casual conversation, but they all knew, and they'd all made their choice to be part of it. Frank told himself it was protection, that having his brothers in the operation meant he could control their exposure, could keep them safer than if they were working for someone else, could make sure they were insulated from the most dangerous parts. Maybe that was true, or maybe Frank needed his brothers because he needed people he could trust absolutely, because in a business where loyalty was always contingent and betrayal was always possible, his brothers were the only people Frank was certain would never sell him out. Blood doesn't betray blood, that's what Frank believed, what he'd built the family side of his operation on. He was wrong, not because his brothers betrayed him, but because he would eventually betray them. January 28, 1975, the FBI raid, 30 agents at 6:47 a.m. Frank in handcuffs in front of his daughter, the empire collapsing in a single morning. The arrest didn't just take Frank, it created waves. Over the following weeks and months, federal agents worked their way through Frank's known associates. Hubert was arrested 2 weeks after Frank, Larry 3 weeks after that, Terrence a month later. They were each charged with various counts related to the drug operation. Federal charges, serious time if convicted, and then Richie Roberts came to Frank with the offer, cooperate, give up everyone, in exchange for 15 years instead of 70. Everyone, the word sat between them like something toxic. Frank knew what everyone meant. It meant his crew, his dealers, his corrupt police connections, his associates in Vietnam, his financial contacts. It meant his brothers. What about family? Frank asked Roberts. Roberts was quiet for a moment. Everyone means everyone. Frank sat with that, let it settle, tried to find a way around it. A version of cooperation that didn't include Hubert and Larry and Terrence. If I give you everything except my brothers, Frank said, what does that do to the deal? It kills it, Roberts said simply. The prosecution needs the full picture. Partial cooperation isn't cooperation. They're my brothers. They were also part of your operation. Their participation is documented. We have evidence. If you don't give them, we build the case around what we already have. They do serious time either way. The only variable is whether you do 70 years or 15. Frank understood the mathematics. His brothers were going to face consequences regardless. The only question was whether Frank could reduce his own sentence by providing testimony, by making the government's case easier, providing testimony against his brothers. Frank asked for 48 hours, got them. He sat in his cell and thought about North Carolina, about the two-room shack, about sharing a bed with Hubert and Larry as boys, about Terrence following him around like a shadow when they were children, about all the Sunday dinners, all the years. He thought about his daughter, about what 70 years meant, about dying in prison, about never being free, and he thought about something darker, something he'd never quite admitted before, that if the situation were reversed, if Hubert or Larry or Terrence were facing 70 years, would they protect Frank at the cost of their own freedom? He didn't know the answer, and not knowing was its own kind of answer. 47 hours later, Frank called for Roberts. Okay, he said. Everyone, the cooperation sessions began, and Frank Lucas named his brothers. He started with the less direct things, their roles, their responsibilities, the structure of how they fit into the operation, technical information that didn't require him to look anyone in the eye. But then came the specific incidents, the documented moments that connected each brother to specific criminal acts, and for those, Frank had to be precise. Had to give dates, locations, details that only someone inside the operation would know. He named Hubert, gave specific details about the Bronx distribution operation, times, routes, contacts, enough to build a case. He named Larry, detailed the financial mechanisms, how money moved, which businesses were used. Specific transactions, he named Terrence, communications, connections, how information flowed through the operation. Every detail Frank gave was another nail, building a prosecution that would take years from each of his brothers' lives. Frank told himself they were going to face consequences anyway, told himself the evidence already existed, told himself he was only accelerating what was inevitable, told himself his brothers would understand. That family survived this kind of thing, that they'd get out eventually and rebuild. He told himself a lot of things, none of them fully worked, because somewhere in the middle of the cooperation sessions, Frank stopped being able to fully justify it to himself, started understanding what he was actually doing, not just giving information, not just accelerating the inevitable. He was choosing himself over his brothers, choosing 15 years over 70, choosing survival over loyalty, choosing his life over theirs. He did it anyway. The first time Frank saw Hubert after the cooperation was made public was in a federal courthouse hallway. Brief, accidental, their cases overlapping in the scheduling. Hubert saw Frank before Frank saw him. And Frank, turning, found his brother's eyes. Hubert was 38 years old, had worked tobacco fields until Frank pulled him out, had run logistics for years, was now facing a federal sentence because his oldest brother had given him up. Hubert didn't say anything, didn't need to, just looked at Frank with an expression that contained everything: disbelief, recognition, grief, not anger, which would have been easier, just grief. The particular grief of someone who has discovered that the person they trusted most in the world is the person who destroyed them. Frank tried to hold that gaze, couldn't. He looked away, and in looking away acknowledged everything. Hubert was sentenced to 8 years, Larry to 6, Terrence to 5. Combined, Frank's brothers served 19 years because Frank chose 15. They served their time, got out, tried to rebuild lives, but they rebuilt them in a world where Frank Lucas was a rat, where the name they shared had become synonymous with betrayal, where every time someone mentioned the Lucas brothers, they meant the ones who got sold out by their own blood. The family never recovered, not fully. There were occasional contacts over the years. Holidays when Mahaly could gather enough of them in the same room, brief phone calls. Perfunctory acknowledgments that they still shared DNA. but the Sunday dinners were gone, the ease was gone, the particular intimacy of brothers who'd built something together was gone, replaced by a wariness that never fully lifted. Because how do you trust someone who gave you to the FBI? How do you sit across a table from the man who chose his freedom over yours and pretend that's okay? You don't, or if you do, it costs something every time. Frank knew what he'd lost. He didn't minimize it. In his more honest moments, admitted that naming his brothers was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than running the empire, harder than prison, harder than any external test, because it was a test of who he fundamentally was, and he'd failed it. Had discovered that when the choice came down to his freedom or his brother's well-being, he chose his freedom. That knowledge lived in Frank for the rest of his life. Every family gathering that felt hollow, every conversation with Hubert that ended too quickly, every missed holiday, every birthday unacknowledged, he'd tell himself the brothers understood, that they'd have done the same, that the empire they'd all participated in had always carried this risk, that none of them were innocent. Sometimes he almost believed it, never fully. Hubert Lucas was the most publicly vocal of the brothers. In occasional interviews over the years, he spoke about what Frank's cooperation had meant for the family. He was measured usually, not melodramatic, just honest. He chose himself, Hubert said once. I understand why. 70 years is a death sentence, but understanding why someone hurts you doesn't make the hurt go away. That was the truth of it. Understanding didn't heal. Explanation didn't restore. The logic of the choice, 15 versus 70, survival versus loyalty, was comprehensible. But comprehensible and forgivable aren't the same thing. And blood, it turned out, could betray blood, not through malice, through necessity, through the simple human drive to survive, which was, in the end, even harder to forgive than malice, because malice gives you something to push against. Necessity just gives you emptiness. The knowledge that when the moment came, family wasn't enough, that the bond Frank had built his entire emotional life on had a limit, had a price, and he discovered that price in a federal holding cell in 1975. Mahalie Lucas lived until 1995. In her final years, she tried to hold what was left of her family together, had her children visit when she could manage it, sometimes separately, sometimes together, read whatever peace existed between them. She never spoke directly about the cooperation, didn't blame Frank publicly, didn't defend him either, just loved all her children with the particular exhausted love of a mother who has watched her family break and can't put it back together but refuses to stop trying. At her funeral in 1995, Frank and his brothers were in the same room for the first time in years, standing around her casket. The family she'd spent her life building. Nobody fought, nobody made accusations, just stood together in that particular silence. The silence of people who share everything and have lost the ability to say so. Frank looked at Hubert across the casket. Hubert looked back, 61 and 58 years old respectively. Old men now, the tobacco fields and the empire and the prison years and the betrayal all behind them. Hubert gave a slight nod, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. We're still here, we're still brothers, it's still broken, and we're still here. Frank nodded back. That was all. That was as close as they got to resolution. Two old men nodding at each other across their mother's casket, acknowledging without repairing, existing without fully connecting. The Lucas family didn't die in 1975, not literally. Mahalie lived another 20 years. Frank lived until 2019. Hubert and Larry and Terrence survived their sentences and rebuilt versions of lives. But something died in 1975, the particular quality of trust that only exists between brothers who have built something together. The ease of unconditional loyalty, the certainty that blood was the one thing that couldn't be broken. Frank Lucas built his empire with his brothers, and when the empire fell, he built his survival on them, used them one final time, not to create something, to save himself. And that transaction, that final use of his brothers as material for his own survival, was the thing the Lucas family never fully recovered from. Not because any of them were entirely innocent, not because the empire they built together was worth protecting, but because family is supposed to be the one place where survival instinct yields to loyalty, where you choose the bond over the cost. Frank Lucas didn't choose the bond, he chose 15 years. And the Lucas family, the one built in a two-room shack in La Grange, North Carolina, on shared hunger and shared promises and the particular love of people who have nothing but each other, that family died quietly in a federal cooperation agreement in 1975. The brothers survived it, Frank survived it, but survival and living aren't the same thing. and for the rest of their lives, the Lucas brothers would know the difference. The cooperation sessions began. And Frank Lucas named his brothers. The first session lasted 9 hours. Frank sat in a windowless federal office with Richie Roberts and 2 other agents, recording equipment running, legal pads filling with names and dates and details that would become prosecution evidence. For the first 4 hours, Frank gave them everything outside the family: street captains, Vietnam connections, corrupt police contacts, financial intermediaries, names and specifics that built a comprehensive picture of an operation that had moved millions of dollars through New York. Then Roberts said, "Tell us about Hubert." Frank was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Roberts looked up from his notepad. "He ran the Bronx distribution," Frank finally said. His voice came out flat, deliberately flat, like he was reading from a document rather than describing his brother. "Coordinated with street-level dealers, managed the delivery schedule. Made sure product moved without patterns that could be tracked." Each sentence about Hubert felt like something being cut away. Not dramatically, just quietly, like a slow amputation performed without anesthetic because the pain needed to be felt fully in order to be real. Then Larry, then Terrence, hour after hour, the family operation disassembled word by word in a windowless federal office while recording equipment captured everything for the prosecution. Roberts noticed Frank's hands shaking slightly during the brothers section, said nothing about it, just kept writing.